Very well said. Chair recognizes Mr. Subrahmanyan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm so glad that committee Republicans finally want to talk about fraud and corruption and misuse of federal funds. This majority, though, has conveniently avoided this topic, but let's talk about the fraud in this administration. And let's start with President Trump accepting a $400 million plane as a gift from Qatar, which the president announced he would transfer afterwards to his presidential library, basically to himself. And then the president announced a $1 trillion economic agreement with Qatar and a security guarantee for them as well, an unprecedented one. Next, Trump has also accepted hundreds of millions of dollars in undisclosed amounts for his ballroom project, including from companies who had civil and criminal charges that were then dropped against them by this administration. And it's not just President Trump. Secretary Kristi Noem has paid more than $200 million in DHS ad contracts last fall and bypassed the normal competitive bidding process to award some of the funds to a firm with deep ties to herself. And then Secretary Noem also spent $170 million of taxpayer dollars on new jets, including one for her own private travel. Family members of the president have entered into $2 billion in business deals with the UAE government and their government officials, while the U.S. Conveniently then signed a major chips agreement with the UAE. And then after his election, President Trump put $4 billion in shares of his media company in a trust to be run by his son. And then President Trump maintained ownership of his business empire while letting his family run the day-to-day. And then in September, Forbes estimated that President Trump's meme coin tokens were worth $709 million, and his World Liberty financial tokens were worth more than $338 million, but we don't know exactly how that happened. Then President Trump also stopped the enforcement of foreign and bribery and fraud so that we could have American companies commit fraud abroad as well and not get prosecuted. President Trump also has made hundreds of visits to his own properties using taxpayer dollars, a lot of golfing included, and used his presidency for personal profit to those properties. In 2019, the GAO reported a trip to Mar-a-Lago costs over $3 million, and so if you add that up, that's a lot of taxpayer money being misused and a lot of fraud. The interim U.S. attorney for D.C. ended prosecution of a January 6th defendant after he represented that defendant in private practice. President Trump pardoned fraudster Trevor Milton, a former CEO convicted of fraud in 2022, who, with the stroke of Trump's pen, escaped paying the $600 million in restitution that prosecutors argued he should pay to people who've invested in his company. According to the Washington Post, at least 20 people who have received clemency from Trump were given forgiveness for financial penalties totaling tens of millions of dollars. And then President Trump pardoned Binance founder Changpeng Zhao, a money launderer, after getting support for a family crypto venture. And then President Trump also pardoned CEO Andrew $1 million of his own money from his own company, but had his case dropped after he donated to the president. And then President Trump also pardoned the founder of the electric vehicle company Nikola, who was convicted of fraud and donated $1.8 million to political committees supporting President Trump. And then prior to his confirmation, Secretary Hegset's wife owned thousands of dollars in defense stocks, including companies that contract with the DoD. And DoD Secretary Hegseth brought his wife, who has defense company investments, to meetings with foreign defense officials at a NATO gathering where Ukraine policy was discussed. And from recently passed funding legislation, U.S. senators can claim over $500,000 in taxpayer dollars over phone record collections during the January 6th investigation. We just commemorated the 5th anniversary of January 6th. And then border czar Tom Homan dodged FBI background checks and accepted $50,000 from undercover agents acting as business people in exchange for government contracts. The DOJ investigation of that was shut down by this administration. President Trump wrote on his social media platform, Truth Social, "This is a great time to buy DJT," less than 4 hours before lifting the tariffs he imposed days earlier, raising accusations of improprieties. I'd say the accusations are probably well-founded. President Trump's FBI director has reportedly used taxpayer dollars to escort his girlfriend's friend home from partying in Nashville. RFK Jr., the secretary, refused to fully cut ties to a vaccine lawsuit against a pharmaceutical company while serving as secretary, arrangement that profits from the suit would go to his son. Saudi-funded golf tournaments moved events to Trump golf courses, providing a financial windfall for President Trump and his family as his administration sets Middle East policy. FBI Director Kash Patel refused to divest from stock holdings in a company that controls a Chinese fast fashion firm accused of using forced labor and child labor, raising questions questions about the extent to which he'd enforce human trafficking laws. President Trump's God Bless the American Bible, which was a $3 production cost and $60 tag per copy, are printed in China. The Bible, however, is exempted from Trump's tariffs on China due to an exemption for religious materials. And I could keep going. Tom Krause, the CEO of Cloud Software, was hired to work on a payment system at the Treasury Department, raising questions about competitive advantages for future contracts. A Cloud Software subsidiary previously donated $1 million to Trump's inaugural fund. And the first directive issued by the U.S. Department of Energy Secretary Chris Wright focused on advancing geothermal energy, which benefits Fervo, in which his former company Liberty Energy had invested $10 million in. Commerce Secretary Lutnick...
Gentleman's time's expired, 40 seconds over, and